The fluorescent lights in the Reed Innovations boardroom hummed overhead as I adjusted my notepad and positioned myself in the corner chair, which was the one nobody ever wanted because it faced away from the windows, making it perfect for someone who was supposed to remain invisible. Sophia, coffee? My stepmother Eleanor snapped her fingers without even looking at me. And make sure it is actually hot this time, unlike yesterday's disaster. I stood quietly, smoothing down my plain gray cardigan, because at 28, I had perfected the art of being the family disappointment. I was the one who dropped out of Stanford, the one who never amounted to anything, and the one who somehow still got pity invitations to family gatherings, because my father felt guilty about something from years ago. "Right away," I said softly, gathering the empty cups scattered across the mahogany table. My half-brother Bradley lounged in my father's right-hand seat, his expensive watch catching the light as he scrolled through his phone, and asked if I could believe they were actually doing this, selling to Meridian Corporation for $340 million, because he had already got his eye on a yacht. "Bradley, focus," my father Arthur Reed commanded from the head of the table. At 62, he still had the commanding presence that had built Reed Innovations from a small electronics distributor into a regional powerhouse. "We need to finalize the share distributions before the representatives arrive," my father said, while checking his watch and ignoring the way the rest of the family looked at me as if I were a servant. I moved silently, pouring the coffee and placing the sugar exactly where they liked it, all while memorizing every detail of the documents laid out on the table, because they had no idea that the invisible girl in the corner was the only one who truly understood what was at stake. The atmosphere in the room was thick with greed, and I could almost smell the desperation, masked by expensive cologne and designer perfume. My younger half-sister Cassandra leaned back, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the glass table, as she announced that a $340 million payout would finally allow her to move to that penthouse in Paris she had been eyeing for months. Bradley laughed, a sharp and grating sound, telling her that she was thinking too small and that they should be looking at private jets, not just apartments. My stepmother Eleanor chimed in, her voice like velvet wrapped around a blade, reminding everyone that they had to remain professional until the papers were signed and the funds were transferred into their respective accounts. Arthur, my father, did not join in their fantasies, but his eyes were fixed on the contract, as if it were the only thing that mattered in the entire world. He looked at me for a split second, his gaze cold and dismissive, before telling me to go fetch the legal binders from the outer office, because the Meridian Corporation representatives were expected to arrive in less than 30 minutes. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral, even as my heart hammered against my ribs, because I knew what was hidden in those files that they had overlooked for so long. They saw me as a dropout, a failure who could not handle the pressure of an Ivy League education. But they never asked why I really left, or what Grandpa Samuel had whispered to me on his deathbed. I walked out of the room, the heavy oak doors closing behind me, and I took a deep breath to steady my hands before returning to the lion's den with the documents that would eventually bring their house of cards tumbling down. I re-entered the room just as my father, Arthur, was spreading a leather-bound document across the center of the table, his face illuminated by the bright light reflecting off the high-gloss finish of the mahogany. Eleanor reached for a pen, her eyes gleaming with a predatory intensity that made me shiver, as she asked if they were absolutely certain that everyone had signed the consent forms for the sale. Bradley leaned forward, his voice dripping with condescension, telling her that it did not matter what anyone else thought, because the four of them held the controlling interest in Reed Innovations. He looked at me as I set the legal binders down, a smirk playing on his lips, and he joked that perhaps they should give me a small bonus from the $340 million, so I could finally buy something that did not come from a clearance rack. I ignored the sting of his words, focusing instead on the way my father's hand tightened around his gold fountain pen, because he knew something that the others had not yet realized. Arthur cleared his throat, a sound that immediately silenced the bickering, and he stated that according to the most recent audit, there was a discrepancy in the share registry that needed to be addressed before the Meridian Corporation representatives walked through the door. My heart skipped a beat, knowing exactly which discrepancy he was referring to, but I kept my face as blank as a sheet of paper. Cassandra rolled her eyes, complaining that paperwork was boring and that they should just sign the deal so she could start her shopping spree in Paris. My father did not laugh. He simply turned the page to the section titled Major Shareholders, and his brow furrowed in confusion as he saw a name that was not his own listed at the very top of the ledger. He muttered that there must be a clerical error because it showed that 82% of the company was held by an entity called J Holdings, which he had never seen before in all his years of running the business. I stood perfectly still, my hands folded neatly in front of my gray cardigan, watching the man who had dismissed me for a decade slowly begin to realize that the ground beneath his feet was not nearly as solid as he believed. Arthur slammed his hand onto the table, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot, as he demanded to know how this was possible. J Holdings, he repeated the name as if it were a curse, his eyes scanning the faces of his wife and children to see if anyone was hiding something from him. Eleanor shook her head, her face pale under the bright boardroom lights, and she whispered that there must be some mistake because they had been managing the accounts for years. Bradley scoffed, adjusted his tie, and said that maybe some old investment from Grandpa Samuel had sat dormant. But there was no way it could account for 82% of the entire corporation. My father ignored him, his breathing becoming heavy and ragged as he remembered the final weeks before Grandpa Samuel passed away, and the way the old man had looked at him with a mixture of pity and disappointment. He muttered that Samuel had always been secretive about his private trust, but this was a betrayal of the highest order, because it meant the family did not actually own the company they were trying to sell for $340 million. Just as the panic began to set in, the heavy oak doors at the end of the hall swung open, and the representatives from Meridian Corporation walked in, led by a man in a sharp blue suit who looked like he had never lost a negotiation in his life. Arthur quickly closed the ledger, trying to force a smile onto his face as he stood up to greet the men who were supposed to be his ticket to a life of ultimate leisure. He turned to me, his voice sharp and urgent, and told me to get out and bring in a tray of ice water and the premium crystal glasses because we needed to keep the guests comfortable while he figured out this mess. I walked toward the door, feeling the weight of the silver key in my pocket, and I knew that the next hour would change the legacy of the Reed family forever. The lead negotiator from Meridian Corporation, a tall and imposing man with sharp eyes named Mr. Thorne, opened his leather portfolio and began to speak with a voice that was as cold as the ice water I was currently pouring into the crystal glasses. He stated that the offer of $340 million was firm, and that they were prepared to wire the funds as soon as the principal shareholder signed the final closing documents. Arthur sat frozen, his fingers twitching against the mahogany surface as he tried to find the right words to explain the situation without admitting that he had lost control of his own kingdom. Eleanor leaned in, her voice a forced whisper of encouragement, telling him to just sign the papers so they could all move on with their lives and escape the stress of the business. But Mr. Thorne did not move. He merely stared at my father with an expression of professional boredom and pointed out that according to the most recent regulatory filings, the 4 people sitting at this table only accounted for 18% of the total equity in Reed Innovations. The room went silent, save for the sound of the air conditioning humming in the background, as the reality of his words began to sink in for Bradley and Cassandra. Bradley slammed his hand down, demanding to know what he was talking about, and claiming that the Reed name was on the front of the building, so of course they owned the majority of the shares. Thorne sighed, pulled out a certified copy of the share registry, and placed it in the center of the table, highlighting the name J Holdings in bright yellow ink. He asked my father quite bluntly, who exactly represented this mysterious entity, because without their signature, the deal was dead in the water, and the $340 million would remain in the bank. I placed the final glass on the tray, my eyes meeting my father's for a fleeting second, and I saw a flicker of genuine terror in his gaze that he had never shown before. They were all beginning to realize that their dreams of luxury yachts and designer penthouses in Paris were slipping away, held captive by a ghost from the past that none of them had ever bothered to investigate or understand. The air in the basement was cool and smelled of old paper and ozone, a sharp contrast to the suffocating tension of the boardroom upstairs. I walked past the rows of steel filing cabinets, my footsteps echoing against the concrete floor, as I made my way to the very back corner where Grandpa Samuel's personal records were kept. My father thought he was sending me on a fool's errand, a way to keep the family disappointment busy, while he scrambled to save his $340 million deal. He had no idea that I had spent the last 5 years in this very basement, not just filing papers, but rebuilding the legacy he was so eager to sell. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small silver key, the one Samuel had pressed into my hand just hours before he passed away, telling me that the truth was never found in the light, but in the shadows where people forgot to look. I unlocked the heavy wooden crate labeled personal correspondence and pulled out a thick leather binder, but I did not need to search for a name or a phone number. I already knew every digit of the account numbers and every clause of the trust agreement, because I was the one who had drafted them under Samuel's guidance during my final semester at Stanford. They thought I dropped out because I could not handle the pressure, but the truth was that I left to protect the company from my father's growing greed. I sat on a small wooden stool, the dim light of a single bulb swinging overhead, and I looked at the clock on the wall. I had 45 minutes left before the deadline, 45 minutes before the man who had treated me like a servant for a decade would have to face the consequence of his own arrogance. I allowed myself a small, quiet smile, the first one in years, as I began to gather the original share certificates that proved beyond any doubt that Sophia Reed was not a failure, but the rightful owner of 82% of Reed Innovations. The invisible girl was about to become the most powerful person in the room, and I wanted to make sure I enjoyed every single second of their collective downfall. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed, a somber reminder that 15 minutes had already slipped away, while the atmosphere in the boardroom upstairs grew more toxic by the second. Mr. Thorne had stopped pretending to be interested in his tablet and was now staring directly at my father, his silence more terrifying than any verbal threat he could have made. Arthur was pacing a tight circle behind his chair, his expensive leather shoes squeaking against the polished floor as he muttered about how Samuel must have been losing his mind in those final days. Eleanor was desperately trying to call their lead counsel, but her voice kept breaking, and she finally slammed her phone onto the mahogany table in a fit of helpless rage. Bradley and Cassandra were at each other's throats, with Bradley accusing his sister of being too distracted by fashion to notice the disappearing equity, while she screamed back that he was supposed to be the one handling the family finances. None of them looked at the door. None of them wondered if the quiet girl in the gray cardigan had found anything at all, because to them, I was just a ghost they had hired to fill their cups. Deep in the basement, I stood at the foot of the stairs, holding the thick leather binder that contained the true heart of Reed Innovations. I thought about the $340 million they were so eager to split, and I thought about the 347 employees whose lives would be ruined by the sale. I remembered the night Grandpa Samuel told me that wealth was a responsibility, not a trophy, and that my father had forgotten the weight of the people who actually built the company. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cold air fill my lungs, and I began the long climb back to the top floor. With every step, I felt the persona of the family disappointment falling away, replaced by the steel and resolve of a woman who had been underestimated for far too long. I reached the heavy oak doors, hearing my father's voice rise in a desperate plea for another hour of Thorne's time, and I realized that the moment of silence was over. It was time for the invisible girl to step into the light and reclaim the legacy that was rightfully mine. I pushed open the heavy oak doors, and the sound of my father's voice pleading with Mr. Thorne cut through the air like a jagged blade. Arthur was leaning over the table, his face pale and sweating, begging for just 10 more minutes, while Mr. Thorne was already standing up and smoothing out the wrinkles in his expensive blue suit. "Sit down, Arthur," I said, but my voice was not the quiet, submissive tone they were used to. It was clear and steady, vibrating with a confidence that seemed to freeze everyone in the room. My stepmother Eleanor turned toward me, her eyes narrow and filled with irritation, and she snapped that I should not interrupt when the grown-ups were talking. Bradley laughed, a mocking sound, and asked if I had finally found a brain in the basement along with the dusty old papers. I ignored them both, walking slowly to the center of the table, and I placed the thick leather binder directly on top of the Meridian Corporation contract. "I found what you were looking for," I said, looking my father straight in the eyes for the first time in 5 years. Arthur scoffed, reaching for the binder with trembling hands, and he muttered that I was probably just bringing him more of my grandfather's useless journals. But as he flipped open the first page, his face went from a dull red to a ghostly white, and he stopped breathing altogether. The document inside was a notarized certificate of ownership for 82% of the shares of Reed Innovations, held in perpetuity by a trust named J. Holdings. Mr. Thorne leaned back in his chair. His interest suddenly piqued, and he asked my father if this was the representative he had been waiting for. Arthur could not speak. He only pointed at the signature at the bottom of the page, which was dated the very day I left Stanford. Eleanor snatched the binder away, her hands shaking as she read the name of the sole trustee and legal representative for J. Holdings. Her voice was a terrified whisper as she looked up at me and asked how a failure like me could possibly be the one holding the keys to their $340 million fortune. I did not answer her right away. I simply reached out and took my father's seat at the head of the table, because the invisible girl was finally ready to be seen. The silence that followed my announcement was heavier than any of the corporate binders on the table, and for a moment, the only sound was the frantic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. My father, Arthur, stared at the notarized signature on the share certificate as if it were a venomous snake, his face turning a sickly shade of gray, while he whispered that this had to be a forgery. Eleanor snatched the leather binder from his trembling hands, her eyes wide with a mixture of greed and terror, as she screamed that there was no way a Stanford dropout like me could ever outsmart a man of Arthur's stature. Bradley stood up so quickly his chair toppled over, and he demanded that Mr. Thorne call the authorities immediately, because I was clearly trying to sabotage the $340 million deal. But Mr. Thorne did not reach for his phone. He simply reached for the binder, his fingers moving with a deliberate slowness that made my stepmother's heart race. He spent several minutes examining the raised seal of the trust and the secondary signatures from the Reed family lawyers before leaning back and looking at me with a new sense of professional respect. "This is quite real, Arthur," Thorne said, his voice cutting through the hysterical shouting of my siblings like a cold wind. "It seems your daughter is not the failure you described, but the sole trustee of J. Holdings, which means she owns 82% of this corporation." My father collapsed into his chair, his commanding presence evaporating into a cloud of confusion and regret, as he asked why I would do this to my own family. I looked around the room at the designer clothes and the luxury watches they wore like armor, and I told them that Grandpa Samuel saw the rot in this family long before I did. He knew that if he left the company to Arthur, it would be sold to the highest bidder within a year, and the 347 people who worked on the factory floor would be thrown out into the street. So we made a choice, 5 years ago, to let you believe I was a disappointment, while I quietly learned every corner of this business from the bottom up. The $340 million you were so ready to spend on yachts and penthouses was never yours to take, because I am the one who decides if this company lives or dies. Mr. Thorne looked at me with a professional curiosity that made the rest of my family seem like children playing at business. He asked quite simply if I, as the sole representative of J Holdings, was prepared to sign the documents and finalize the $340 million acquisition of Reed Innovations. Before I could speak, my stepmother Eleanor lunged across the table, her voice a desperate shriek as she begged me to think of the family and the lifestyle we could all enjoy if I just put my name on that dotted line. Bradley joined in, his arrogance replaced by a frantic pleading, promising that he would never call me a failure again if I would just secure his portion of the payout. My father, Arthur, was silent, his eyes fixed on the man he had once been, the man who had built this company from nothing and was now willing to sell its soul for a check. I looked at the Meridian Corporation representatives, then at the manufacturing floor, visible through the glass partitions, where 347 men and women were working, unaware that their livelihoods were being treated like poker chips. I told Mr. Thorne that while $340 million was a significant sum of money, it was not enough to purchase the heritage that Grandpa Samuel had entrusted to me. I informed the board that as the majority shareholder, I was formally withdrawing Reed Innovations from the market, and that the acquisition by Meridian Corporation was officially terminated. The room exploded in a chorus of outrage from Bradley and Cassandra, while Eleanor collapsed back into her chair, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. My father finally looked up at me, his voice a broken whisper, asking me how I could be so selfish as to deny them their wealth. I told him that I was not being selfish. I was being responsible, and that the only thing I was denying them was the chance to destroy everything Samuel had spent 40 years building. Mr. Thorne stood up, closed his portfolio with a sharp snap, and told my father that it had been a fascinating hour, but that it was clear Arthur Reed was no longer the man in charge of this room. As the Meridian team walked out, leaving my family in a state of absolute ruin, I realized that the real work was only just beginning, and that the invisible girl was finally the only one standing. The boardroom door clicked shut, and the silence that rushed back into the room was deafening, as my family stared at me with expressions ranging from pure shock to murderous rage. Bradley was the first to break the tension, his face turning a dark shade of purple as he screamed that I had just cost him $85 million and that he would see me in prison for what I had done. I did not even look at him. I simply opened the binder to the section detailing the employee conduct policies and the executive termination clauses that Grandpa Samuel had insisted on including. I told Bradley that since he had spent the last 3 years charging personal vacations and luxury car leases to the company accounts, his employment at Reed Innovations was terminated effective immediately. He froze, his mouth hanging open like a landed fish, while Cassandra began to sob, wailing about how she was supposed to be in Paris by the end of the month. I turned to my sister and told her that her position in the marketing department, which she had not actually visited in over 14 months, was also being eliminated as part of a necessary corporate restructuring. Eleanor stood up, her eyes like cold flints as she hissed that I was a monster, and that Arthur would find a way to strip me of every share I owned. My father, however, did not speak. He just sat in his chair with his head in his hands, looking like a man who had finally realized that the world he built on lies had completely vanished. I looked at the three of them and stated that they had 1 hour to clear out their desks and return their corporate credit cards, or I would have the security team escort them from the building in front of everyone. Arthur finally looked up, his voice cracking as he asked where I expected him to go. After everything he had done for me, I reminded him that he had done nothing but treat me as an invisible servant, while he planned to sell the lives of 347 people for a bigger bank account. I told him he could keep his house and his car, but from this moment forward, the offices of Reed Innovations were off limits to anyone who did not value the legacy of Samuel Reed. As they slowly filed out of the room, defeated and broken, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I had been carrying since the day I left Stanford. The boardroom was finally quiet, and for the first time in my life, I was not the girl in the corner. I was the woman at the head of the table, wearing my plain gray cardigan and looking out at the empire I had saved. I watched through the glass walls as the three of them, Arthur, Eleanor, and Bradley, stood by the elevator, their shoulders slumped and their expensive briefcases feeling suddenly very heavy. They were not just leaving a building, they were leaving a life of unearned luxury that had been funded by the hard work of people they never even deigned to look at. I turned my attention to the office phone and dialed the extension for the Director of Human Resources, a woman named Sarah, who had been with Reed Innovations since the very beginning. When she answered, her voice was tight with the anxiety that had been rippling through the entire facility ever since the rumors of the $340 million sale first surfaced. "Sarah, it is Sophia," I said, and for the first time in years, I did not have to hide the authority in my tone. I told her to send out a company-wide announcement immediately, stating that the merger with Meridian Corporation had been canceled, and that every single one of the 347 jobs at this company was secure. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, followed by a shaky breath as the weight of that news sank in. She asked me who had authorized such a massive change in direction, and I told her that as the new chairperson of the board, I was taking full responsibility for the future of the company. After I hung up, I walked out of the boardroom and down the hallway, toward the small, cramped office where I had spent the last 5 years filing papers and making coffee. I looked at the gray cardigan I was still wearing, a simple garment that had been my armor for so long, and I realized that I no longer needed to hide behind the mask of a failure. I began to gather the few personal items I had kept there. But as I reached for my favorite mug, the door opened, and my father Arthur stepped inside, looking older and more fragile than I had ever seen him. He asked me if I really hated them that much, to take away everything they had worked for. I looked at him, not with anger, but with a profound sense of clarity, and I told him that I did not do this because I hated him. I did it because I loved the legacy that he was willing to throw away for a check. Arthur moved toward the exit, his footsteps heavy on the plush carpet, as he realized that the power he had wielded for 3 decades had evaporated in a single morning. I did not follow him to the elevator. Instead, I walked in the opposite direction, toward the glass doors that led to the heart of the factory. I could see the workers through the windows. 347 individuals who had spent their morning in a state of terror, waiting for the news that would likely end their careers. I pushed open the double doors, and the roar of the machinery washed over me like a tidal wave, a sound that I had grown to love during my years in the shadows. Sarah, the Director of Human Resources, was already there, her eyes red from crying, but she had a microphone in her hand and a look of pure relief on her face. She handed the microphone to me, and the room began to fall silent, one machine at a time, as the men and women in their blue coveralls gathered around the central platform. I looked at their faces, the weary eyes, and the calloused hands, and I realized that these were the people Grandpa Samuel had truly cared about. I spoke clearly, my voice carrying to every corner of the vast facility, telling them that the sale to Meridian Corporation had been officially terminated, and that their jobs were secure, under the new leadership of J. Holding. For a moment, there was a stunned silence, followed by a roar of celebration that was louder than any machine in the building. Men hugged each other. Women wept with relief. And for the first time in my life, I felt the true weight of the legacy I had inherited. It was not about the $340 million. It was about the 347 families who could sleep soundly tonight because the invisible girl had finally chosen to stand up and fight. As I walked back to the executive elevator, I felt a strange warmth in my chest, and I knew that Grandpa Samuel was watching from somewhere, nodding his head in approval, because the tree he planted 20 years ago was finally beginning to bear fruit. The factory floor was still echoing with cheers as I stepped back into the quiet elegance of the executive elevator, the golden doors sliding shut on the life I used to lead. I reached the top floor and walked past the empty reception desk, and the silence here now felt peaceful rather than oppressive, as if the building itself were breathing a sigh of relief. I entered my father's old office, which was now officially mine, and looked at the boxes Eleanor and Bradley had left behind in their haste to escape the reality of their new lives. There were half-finished bottles of expensive champagne and brochures for luxury resorts, remnants of a future that had vanished the moment I opened that leather binder. I walked over to the large mahogany desk, but I did not sit in the chair just yet. Instead, I moved toward the small hidden safe in the corner that my father had never been able to open. I used the small silver key one last time, my hand steady as I turned the mechanism, and the heavy door swung open to reveal a single white envelope with my name written in Grandpa Samuel's sharp and elegant handwriting. I sat on the floor, the same way I used to as a little girl, while he told me stories about the early days of Reed Innovations, and I began to read his final words of wisdom. He told me that he knew the day would come when the family would try to trade their honor for gold, and that he had spent his final years ensuring I would have the tools to stop them. He reminded me that a true leader does not sit on a throne, but stands on the foundation built by the people who believe in the vision. I felt a single tear roll down my cheek, not out of sadness, but out of a profound sense of gratitude, because I was no longer the invisible girl hiding in the shadows of a greedy empire. I stood up, placed the letter in the top drawer of the desk, and looked out the window at the city skyline, knowing that tomorrow the world would wake up to a very different company. I stood in the center of the office that was now mine, feeling the weight of the silence and the profound sense of peace that comes when justice is finally served. In the corner of the room, half hidden behind a stack of old filing cabinets, I found one more thing that Grandpa Samuel had left for me. It was a small, weathered wooden plaque that had hung on his wall for over 40 years, and on it were the words, "The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is today." I reached out and touched the carved letters, feeling the connection to the man who had seen my potential, when the rest of the world only saw a failure in a plain gray cardigan. I hung the plaque back on the wall where it belonged, right above the mahogany desk, and I realized that my 12 years of being invisible had been the most important training of my life. I had learned how to listen, how to observe, and how to understand the true heart of Reed Innovations without the distraction of ego or the blind pursuit of wealth. I opened my laptop and looked at the long list of tasks that awaited me, because although the battle for control was over, the real work of rebuilding the company was only just beginning. There were 347 families counting on me to lead with integrity, and I was determined to prove that a legacy built on love and respect was far more valuable than $340 million. I thought about Arthur, Eleanor, and Bradley, wondering if they would ever understand what they had truly lost. Not in money, but in the chance to be part of something meaningful. The city lights began to twinkle outside the window, casting long shadows across the floor. And for the first time in a very long time, I did not feel like a ghost in my own life. I sat down in the large leather chair, adjusted my gray cardigan, and felt a quiet strength settle over me like a familiar blanket. Tomorrow, the employees would walk through the doors and find a leader who truly cared, and a vision that was no longer for sale to the highest bidder. But tonight, I simply allowed myself to be Sophia Reed, the girl who finally chose to be seen. Somewhere in the quiet air of the room, I could almost hear Grandpa Samuel whispering, "Well done, Sophia. Now show them what you are truly capable of." This was not the end of the story. It was merely the beginning of a new chapter, where the invisible girl would lead her people into a future that was built to last.